Yeah, I see
Okay,
that. Okay,
awesome.
sounds good.
All right. Well, it's great to see you. Professor Eaton, thank you so much for your willingness to sit down and talk with me today. Um, I think I'll sort of clue our viewers into what exactly it is we're doing. Um,
Okay.
I titled this Zoom meeting "A Journalist and a Political Scientist Walk into a Zoom Room," and I thought that was a nice summary of the kind of spirit of what we're about. Um, you all may have noticed that there is a presidential election that's going to be happening in November of 2020. It feels like it's been happening for 2 years already. So, in light of that fact, Professor Eaton and I thought it would be interesting for us to sit down as a journalist and as a political scientist and talk together about what tools our respective areas of study and expertise provide that can help us make sense of this whirlwind of political activity that is happening all around us. So that's the spirit of this conversation. I hope you all find it interesting, enlightening, thought-provoking, and all those things. So let's start with some introductions. Professor Eaton, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, about your professional background, your past experience, and what it is exactly that you do here at Flagler?
Sure. Uh, I worked in newspapers for 24 years before I joined Flagler College. And the reason I got into newspapers was it goes really back to college. I was in the hallway and a professor came up to me and said, "Hey, why don't you apply for the Fulbright program?" And I said, "Well, what's that?" And he explained that you apply to study anything you want anywhere in the world. And if you get it, they give you a bunch of money and you go and do your study. And so I applied to go to Ecuador to do a study on the oral history of indigenous groups in Ecuador. And, and I got the grant, and I have a visual aid as proof, which is this is an actual quiver that holds poisonous darts. And these are the actual poisonous darts, which have curare on them, which paralyzes a monkey. And then the indigenous groups, they eat the monkeys. And monkeys are real smart. And so they will try to pull the little arrow out. And so they use this piranha jaw to make a notch in the dart so that the poisonous part stays, it breaks off and stays inside the monkey or the bird or whatever. But anyway, I spent a whole year, just about a year, with indigenous groups. I spent a lot of time with the Warani, which is a group that gained fame in the late 50s because they killed 5 North American missionaries. And I wanted to know about their beliefs, why they do what they do. And anyway, it was a fascinating thing. And I thought, because all I did is I traveled around, took pictures and interviewed people. And I thought, wow, what job would allow me to do this and get paid for it? Journalism. And that's when I decided to study journalism. And so I worked in newspapers, and I decided I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And so I worked my way toward that and was eventually a foreign correspondent. And I worked throughout Latin America and other countries. And then after a while, I decided I wanted to try something different and came to Flagler College. And I'm so grateful to teach at Flagler because it's, first of all, a beautiful campus. The students are great. And the classes that I teach all pretty much deal with journalism, writing, reporting, making videos. I also teach occasionally intro to media. Sometimes I teach speech. And so that's what I do. I'm in the communication department. And feel free to stop by.
Well, that's wonderful. My wife is from Ecuador. We were just kind of talking about that beforehand. So it's so interesting that was sort of the launching pad for what would become your career as a journalist. That's really cool to hear. Okay, so you're a journalist. You don't have like an academic background. You're coming at this from the perspective of a practicing journalist. And I know just personally that you still engage in journalism. You're not exclusively a professor of journalism and communication. You continue to do journalism. So I'm so excited that you have that kind of practical perspective and experience. So given your background, given your experience as a professional journalist, how do you view the role of journalism, the press, the media in a healthy, flourishing democracy?
Well, I think that journalists have a responsibility and a duty to, for instance, if they're covering a presidential campaign or any kind of political campaign, to fact check the candidates and see if they're trying to find out whether or not they're telling the truth. Journalists should try to hold government officials accountable and find out if tax dollars are being spent wisely. Journalists should report on public policy debates and things that affect the general population. And in general, the whole idea of a journalist in a healthy democracy is to do the best they can to inform the citizenry so that people can make decisions based on good information when they vote for somebody. And so that's the fundamental role.
Okay. How do you think our media right now in the US is living up to that role? Are they getting it right? Are they getting it wrong?
Well, first, I think it would be important to ask, well, which media? Because there are so many different media outlets. And if you just Google media bias, you can find these interesting charts that show, according to experts, who is trying to base their stories on facts and primary sources and documents, and then where is their misinformation and more opinion. And so I think it would be important to analyze, okay, which media outlets? And it's a difficult question because, of course, you can ask a lot of different people if they think the media is doing their job, and it depends what their beliefs are, how they'll answer that question. But as a journalist, the way I would answer that question is, if you look in the right places at the media organizations that really are in the middle trying to tell their stories not based on their opinions, then I think that yes, the media is doing its job. This is in a way a golden era for investigative journalism. We have more tools, more ways to investigate and find out what's going on than ever before. And if you look at over the past couple years, the Pulitzer Prize winning stories for public service, and you really just read those stories, you find amazing, amazing work. Reporters who sometimes spend all year, or teams of reporters spend all year investigating corruption and other things that are in the public interest, meaning the idea is to expose a wrong or a problem in the hopes that government or others will try to solve that problem. So it's not that journalists are malicious or want to always tell bad news, but it's that part of the duty is to point out some of the problems in society with the hope that it be corrected.
This is a nice segue into my next question. In fact, you've already sort of answered it, but I'll ask it anyway. How do you view the relationship between your professional role as a journalist and your civic role as a citizen in a democracy? It sounds like you understand there to be a kind of symbiosis and harmony there. Am I right?
Definitely. It's funny you should say that, because there really is, the role of journalist and citizen overlap. The reason that I say they overlap, because I think journalism makes me a better informed citizen, because I do spend a lot of time digging into different issues. And so I think that helps me as a citizen. Now, where I would draw the line is, at least in my case, I try to be a little bit guarded about political opinions that I put out there. I don't put my political opinions on social media. I really don't discuss political opinions in the classroom either, because I don't want to alienate people. I want people to feel, both sources in journalism and students in the classroom, I want them to feel comfortable about talking about their opinions. And my opinion doesn't matter in that sense. I mean, you know, I'll tell a student how I think they should cover a topic, but I'm not going to give an opinion on that. I mean, I don't see that as my role. And in fact, many media outlets, when I do freelance journalism, I have to sign a contract usually that outlines the responsibilities or the role of my role. And many of them will have a rule that says that, you know, a journalist cannot take part in political activities, can't be in a campaign, and that sort of thing. And I am registered as an independent. Mm. And so, and that's on purpose, because I don't want my views to get in the way of my journalism. And I wore this T-shirt as a joke.
I was going to say you're endorsing some candidates right here.
I know. It's a joke because, you know, this is from the Seinfeld program, which might be, I don't know if our students ever watch that. But
ancient history. We may as well be talking about Aristotle.
Yeah. I debated what T-shirt to wear today. I could have gone with the coronavirus theme. And then I thought, no, that's too much of a downer. So then another idea was, well, I could wear this shirt that I picked up in the Middle East. But I thought, this would be too controversial, I think, you know. I'm not into controversy. Or I could get this T-shirt that I got in Cuba, Che Guevara, but as it turns out, Che Guevara is a pretty controversial figure. And that's not what I want to do. I mean, I keep my opinions and my T-shirts here at home. I don't go out and try to broadcast my opinions.
The way you're speaking about your understanding of your role as a journalist, it reminds me of Socrates in the Apology, where he sort of likens his role to a gadfly, right? His role as a citizen in Athens is to point out and kind of put his finger on and dig around in the wound until it itches and irritates problems, right? And he doesn't see that as kind of, you know, partisan advocacy. He sees it as a kind of broader activity he's doing in the service of the public interest and the public good. So would you agree with that like a journalist is a kind of Socratic gadfly?
I love that description. You know, sometimes I tell my students about, you know, back in the early days of my newspaper career, I covered City Hall in Fort Lauderdale for the Miami Herald. And one of my duties was to go into the mayor's office, and I would sit at the secretary's desk and wait until the mayor read his mail. And once it went into the outbox, it was mine. Under Florida's Sunshine Law, you know, the public's right to know, I can look at his mail as soon as he's done with it. And I would sit there and wait till he would go through the morning mail. And then the secretary would go in and give it to me, and I would go through it and look for stories, look for ideas, look for sources. And I tell that to some people, and they think that that's very intrusive and that shouldn't really go on. And to me, it's kind of cool because, you know, we really should know what the government does. It's our money, so we should know what the government does. And I don't think there's enough openness. And one problem that occurs is that if people don't know what their rights are, they start to forget them and our rights start to erode. You know, we have the right to file freedom of information requests to the federal government to find out what's going on. You know, I write about the federal government from time to time. In one year, I think it was around 2012, a full 1/3 of all the freedom of information requests that went to the State Department were mine. I mean, I'm a nosy guy. And I like to dig into to see what's going on, and you can find interesting things that are in the public interest if you dig around. But as time goes on, sometimes we forget what our rights are. There's an organization that advocates for the First Amendment that does a survey every year. And in the 2019 survey, 16% of respondents confused the First Amendment with the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. And 29% said the First Amendment went too far. And to me, it's astounding to think that here we are in America and some people think that we have too many rights. unfortunately, that feeds into what some politicians, without naming names, would prefer because it's convenient, it's more convenient for them. You know, in this climate right now, the Reporters Without Borders, which rates things like freedom of the press in different countries, they do a study every year to rank countries in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of the press. The US ranks 45 out of 180 countries, 45. And that's because of the harassment of journalists, the detention of journalists, and there's at one point the US government was putting journalists on a secret list if they were asking certain questions, and then they were flagged when they would go across the US-Mexico border for questioning if they were on that list. So, I mean, these are things that occurred in countries, the so-called developing nations, that I used to cover when I was a foreign correspondent, and they're happening here in the United States. And so I think that it's incumbent on us as citizens to really be media literate and try to examine very carefully what you read in the news that you get, and decide, well, is it coming from a credible source, a reputable source? And dig into, if there's certain information being pushed out there, ask yourself, who's paying for it? Who's benefiting from this information? Is it true? And just don't believe the opinions that are out there, even though they may be well-financed opinions. Dig in and find out, do research, talk to experts, look at documents and primary sources, and try to figure out what the truth is. Just don't believe what's out there.
Excellent. My final question was going to be about this issue of fake news, which there's been a lot of discussion about and anxiety about. So what do you make of the way this notion of fake news is sort of being bandied about? What's your response?
Well, I think just the term, to throw out that something is fake news, it's a political statement, really, to say that it's an attempt, I think, to delegitimize what may be a fact. And I think that it's important for students and anyone in our country to really study, study the media and, figure out where is the credible information coming from. I think one of the big dangers of fake news is that a lot of people believe it, and then it can influence who gets into office, and that can influence, policies and things that affect the whole nation. And so I think if you look at, and I guess I'm really segueing into misinformation and false narratives that can be harmful. I mean, don't believe the politicians. I don't care if they're Republican, Democrat. As a journalist, I have done investigative stories about candidates of all parties. I don't really care. I've just tried to see what are stories that the public would want to know and should know. What will help them make better decisions and be better citizens. That's the thing that I push for.
All right. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Now it's your turn to be on the hot seat now.
I'm much more comfortable asking the questions.
Me too. Okay, so could you please tell us about your background, why you decided to study political science, and how you wound up at Flagler College?
Sure. So I was actually a student at Flagler College before I was a professor here. And Flagler College is really central to the story of me becoming a political scientist and taking an interest in political science as a discipline. I came into college, like I think a lot of young people, without a really solid sense of who I was or what I wanted to do with my life. I knew what my parents had done. And, I knew what, the people in my community, friends and family and stuff, I knew the kind of careers that they had pursued. And, so I basically thought my options were like firefighter, police officer, nurse, real estate appraiser, like those, or teacher, because I had been a student, right, in high school, middle school, elementary school, and I had great relationships with teachers. So I decided that I'd be a terrible firefighter, I'd be a terrible police officer, I'd be a terrible nurse because I'm not a courageous person. So I was like, teacher, sounds like something I'd be interested in. So I came in as an education major, and I ended up in a general education course, fulfilling those gen ed requirements that we all love. It was Introduction to Political Thought 1, taught by Professor Art Vandenhouten, who's now our Dean of Academic Life. And I was just taken by, the books we were reading and the ideas we were considering and the questions we were grappling with. And, so then in my second week as a freshman, I'm in this course that I kind of love. And then boom, 9/11 happens. Those planes crash into the World Trade Center. And, I was just desperate, like everyone was at that time, to understand why that had happened. And I felt like political science was going to give me the tools I needed to make sense of this really bewildering, frightening world. So that was sort of what sparked my interest in it. So yeah, I think, was that your question? Did I answer your question?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I find it fascinating too, just the impact of 9/11. Sometimes when I'm in the classroom, I forget that we're getting to a point, I'm getting so old now,
yeah,
that there are some students who,
they weren't born.
They weren't born. That's what I was trying to spit out.
Yeah.
They weren't born. I remember when it happened, I was in Mexico City on an assignment, and after it happened, I called my boss. I was glued to CNN watching the whole thing, and I just couldn't pull away. And I called my boss and I said, whatever we're doing, I know we're going to retaliate. The US is going to retaliate, and I want to cover it. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Afghanistan and covered the fighting there.
Wow.
And but that even today, it seems like it was yesterday. I still remember a lot of things so clearly. Mm-hmm. And so 9/11 had a huge impact. I remember as a teenager going into the World Trade Centers. When it was being built, my dad worked in New York City, and I went in there pretending to be a construction worker and walked up to the 80-something floor and looked out of open windows that didn't have a window in it yet.
Wow.
And it was so cool. And then after it was open, then I went there. When it was open, you could go up to the observation area. And so to see that structure fall down, it seemed like, wow, is this the end of America? What's going on here?
Yeah.
And so it's wild that this was provided a little bit of a spark for you to try to use political science to understand what's going on in our country. And what classes do you teach at Flagler College?
I teach now. I teach that course that first sparked my interest in political science. I teach Intro to Political Thought 1 and 2. I teach feminist political thought. I recently taught a special topics course on the politics of pornography. That's sort of my area of scholarly expertise. I study gender and sexuality and where they intersect and overlap with politics. So yeah, I mean, kind of like everybody at Flagler, I teach all the things. I teach a whole range of things.
Well, we for sure we're living in a time when there are a lot of divisions in this country. And as a reflection of those divisions, we've seen criticisms of many of our institutions, including higher education. And I've seen on social media some people saying, oh, you got to be careful about colleges because they're brainwashing our kids. They are, giving them a liberal education, they're liberal ideas, extreme leftist views. You hear that sort of thing. As a political scientist, how do you view that And do you ever have to deal with that in the classroom?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'll fall into conversations with colleagues who don't teach political science often about this. Like, how do you broach these political controversies in the classroom? And this is like literally my job, is to talk about these things. Like, I know some faculty will say, "Oh, I'll just try to bracket that. I'm here to teach them about sociology," or I'm not here to, but like, it is literally my job to teach them about politics. So I don't really have the luxury or the option of setting all that aside. When it comes to the critiques of, some kind of left-wing bias in higher ed, I mean, on one level, there, like every kind of kooky opinion, there's like a kind of grain of truth there. I mean, if you look at public opinion polling of people who's put their profession as college professor, right, you will find that they do have a lot of political opinions that they lean left, right? There's no denying that. But I think that often those, I think of like Turning Point USA, who's this kind of conservative activist group that has really made an effort to target certain professors and accuse them of having some kind of, left-wing bias. I think often those people they're not doing that in good faith. They're not doing that because they worry in a kind of sincere way about having a robust, diverse exchange of ideas. They're doing that because they would prefer to control the universities and use them as, siege engines of indoctrination, right? So that, I guess I kind of react to that critique often with a lot of skepticism and incredulity, because you got to consider the source. I also think that sometimes these critiques result from a misunderstanding of what the term liberal means. So Flagler College is a liberal arts college. That does not mean that it is an organ of the Democratic Party. The word liberal, I'll tap into my political theorist, mode here. It dates back to, around the kind of 18th, 19th century. And it was first used in Spain. A political party described itself as, the liberales. They were the first liberals. And they stood for constitutional government as opposed to monarchy. They stood for individual rights and liberties, as opposed to a kind of society based on ascribed status, right? Liberal means like John Locke and John Stuart Mill. So a liberal education, a liberal arts education, was meant to be an education that would prepare an individual for a life as a free individual in a liberal constitutional democracy, right? So that's the sense in which we are, right? We are liberal, right? Because our role is to prepare our students to live lives of liberty, of kind of active citizenship, to allow our students to be the authors of their own lives, as opposed to just being kind of buffeted back and forth by these external forces, right? So in that sense, I'll kind of cop to the critique. Like, I am engaged in a project of liberal indoctrination in that sense, right? Does that make sense? Have I answered the question?
Yeah. So suppose, we know that our students we'll see the wide political spectrum of views among our students. So how would students who have very diverse views feel in your classroom, and how would you make them feel, all of them, welcome? Or would you make them feel uncomfortable?
I hope I make them feel uncomfortable, honestly. That's my goal. I want to challenge whatever you come into my classroom with as your preset. I want you to leave my classroom feeling kind of deeply unsettled and uncertain about all that. I'm not out to change your mind. I'm not out to persuade you to come over to some particular point of view. I am out to get you to realize that things are way more complex than you initially realized, that to the kinds of questions that at least politics grapples with, there are no easy, obvious, uncontroversial answers. And I want to just like stir up that discomfort in your gut. I want you to lose sleep.
I think you're the best kind of professor, because I remember back to college, the professors who did that with me are the ones that I like the most, because they got me thinking. You know, that's the whole part of the whole idea, is to get people thinking. And like you say, not try to convince anyone of anything, but just to open their minds. Yeah. And it's amazing how that you're right. There are so many things that are much more complex than we think. As a journalist, I've been amazed to learn that there are, you know, as I research a story, I'll go on to Google Scholar and I'll start putting in keywords for whatever I'm writing about. And I'll find that for almost every topic, there is an expert on that topic. One time I did a story on these African snails that were devouring everything in their path in Cuba, you know, eating through stone and shell, and not just plants and trees, and just—
This is horrifying. I feel like this is on my 2020 bingo card for October.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. So I start Googling, and it turns out there are a number of people who have spent their entire lives dedicated to snails. And it's like that with everything. And I think the professors like you are so wonderful, because you can open up people's eyes and let them know that things are much more complex than they thought. But there are experts who can help answer questions too.
Yeah, for sure.
So I also majored in political science when I was an undergrad at Rutgers College. And I really enjoyed political science. I loved my classes. But I remember the quizzical look that I would get from my dad when I told him I was studying political science. And he would say, well, what are you going to do with that? What's political science good for? Can you talk a little bit about how something that to an outsider may seem kind of academic and esoteric, and talk about maybe some of the practical applications that it could have?
Sure. So, you know, a lot of people who study political science do go on to work in politics. It does provide a pretty good preparation if you want to work on political campaigns, if you want to run for office yourself, if you want to do political journalism. You know, political science, it teaches you the nuts and bolts of government, and the nuts and bolts of how a campaign works, and the nuts and bolts of how polling works, and how to do it, and how to interpret it. And, you know, so there are a lot of I think really kind of practical dimensions to the discipline. That's not where I hang out a lot, but I have tons of friends who do that kind of work. For me, why political science matters, it kind of connects back to the story I told about how I came to be interested in political science as an undergraduate. I think it really provides a powerful set of tools for understanding what the hell is happening in the world around us. Political science is interesting if you look at the history of it as an academic discipline. It kind of grows out of, I would say, two separate streams that way predate modern social science. So the first kind of stream that contributes to the discipline would be political philosophy or political theory, which is what I specialize in. And, you know, these are, this is the project of kind of critically reflecting on the norms and values that ought to structure our political lives. So questions like, what is justice, right? We all think that one of the things we need politics for is to get justice. Well, what does that mean? And then how do we design our institutions in such a way that they can lead us to that result? Equality, freedom, right? These are not uncontroversial concepts with kind of clear and obvious meanings. These are, you know, what political theorists called essentially contested concepts. right? So there's a whole history, thousands of years old, spanning, multiple continents, that's devoted to reflecting on those sorts of questions. And that is one of the origin points for the discipline of political science. So there's obviously a historical component there too, right? Because if you want to understand those texts and those concepts and those reflections, then you need to understand the historical context that produced them. So this introduces this kind of second contributing stream to the discipline of political history. Later, right, in the 19th century in particular, you do get, the rise of what we today would call social science. And there is now, that has been sort of grafted onto this older stem of the discipline. So, there's a lot of people who study political science who are just hotshot statisticians and who are just killer formal modelers, right? They do all the math, right? So, I think political science is kind of cool because it gives you this huge arsenal or battery of tools. I'm mixing metaphors that you can draw on to help make sense of the political world, which is always confusing. So,
well, since I am a nosy journalist, I did before, even though you and I were acquainted previously, I did look at your online bio, and it was so impressive, all the research that you do. I don't know how you managed to do so much writing and researching, and I wondered what, I'm sure there are times when, you'd rather be watching Netflix, but you're researching something. What motivates you to really do all that research, and what gives you the high energy?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I have a cynical response, right? Which is the exigencies imposed upon me externally by the brutal realities of the academic job market. I mean, I desperately wanted to get a job as a political science professor coming out of grad school, and to do that, you gotta publish, you gotta research.
It's not easy.
Yeah, and so that was one big motivator. But I think also, I mean, I here I am. I have a job at Flagler where there are research expectations, but they're not. It's not like if I was at an R1, kind of more an institution that was, its primary purpose was scholarship and research. I'm at a teaching college, but here I am. I'm still doing it. So clearly something else motivates me to do it. I don't know. I mean, I really like writing. I used to be a songwriter. And so, yeah, there's just, it's probably similar to why you, as a journalist, right, enjoy telling the stories that you tell. I mean, there's a kind of delight in having an idea, seeing a connection, hearing a story, and then putting it together in a way that's going to be accessible and meaningful to others and sharing it. So I think
you're right. I read once that people who have some creative aspect to their lives are the most happy, and I think there could be something to that. It's fun to do something creative. So I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier about why you got into political science and how it helps you better understand the world that we're living. You've probably heard of there have been numerous quotes saying something like, a fish in water doesn't know it's wet because it's surrounded by, all it knows is wetness and water, so it doesn't, have an understanding of it. And are we like that? Or, are we living in some kind of special time that's different, but we don't realize it because we face such a barrage of information all the time? Or is the pace of information that we have to try to digest coming at us at such a pace that we don't stop long enough to reflect on what it means and make sense of it? How do you make sense of the times we're living now? Because it certainly isn't, and I can't make sense of it, but but it certainly isn't like it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago.
Mm. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think for me, one of the things I like about the perspective that studying politics as a political theorist or as a political science gives me is that it does help me take a moment and step back from like what you described as this kind of barrage of stimuli, and because on one level, yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I have a New York Times app on my phone. I get the I get the notifications, right? And it can be overwhelming, and it can really feel like we're living in really unprecedentedly kind of chaotic times that we're experiencing. And you'll hear the media. No offense, but you'll hear folks in the press who maybe don't have this kind of perspective that the study of political science gives them. Just they're caught up in that news cycle. That's their life, and they'll say things like, "Oh man, like we've never had such a degree of political polarization in the country," right? Or you'll hear activists, not to just throw journalists under the bus. You'll hear activists in the United States like, "Oh, America, we've never faced this kind of threat to our democratic institutions and norms before." Systemic racism has never been more virulent, or something like that. And like on one level, I get people are trying to do that gadfly thing. They're trying to spur a kind of lethargic public into action. And one way to do that is, by raising the alarm. So I get why people do it, but I think that studying political science, studying political theory, studying the history of politics helps me realize that I'm very suspicious whenever somebody says that whatever blah is unprecedented. I'm very suspicious of that. Like, okay, so let me just, I'm speaking very abstractly. I'll pick a concrete example. Okay, so people who are critical of the Trump administration and who are very anxious about the various ways that President Trump is expanding executive power, challenging longstanding democratic norms, activating sort of nationalist sentiments. I often hear in that a kind of American exceptionalism, right? Like, this has never happened here. This can't happen here. It's happening here. And America is like somehow unique in that it's happening here. But what my training as a political scientist encourages me to do is sort of step back and survey, the state of global politics right now. And what you see is like right-wing populism and nationalism is on the rise globally. Like, I can rattle off like a dozen or so countries off the top of my head where you're seeing very similar phenomenon to what I just described is causing all this consternation and anxiety in the US: Austria, Brazil, Italy, India, Indonesia, Poland, Bolivia, right? So it's like, some people may say that's even more reason for panic and alarm, which I get, right? But my response is to say like, oh wow, like this isn't some like unique affliction of the American soul, or whatever, however people talk about it. Like, this is like a global trend, right? And the causal factors that are fueling it in Bolivia, Poland, Brazil, or whatever I just said, we can look at those, and then we can like do like a comparative political scientist would do, and kind of look at the US and try to better understand the underlying causal factors driving this trend. And that's going to help us respond to it in a kind of smarter, more deliberate way than just kind of anguish and panic and alarm. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
Yes. And I have one more question before I get around to it. I share any frustration that you might feel when you watch cable news and you see what journalists or supposed journalists say. And sometimes I either have to turn it off or mute it, and I'm a journalist and I love news. And one of the things that drives me nuts is just how the news media has become so opinionated, because I'm kind of old fashioned. I like to just know, well, what happened? And can I hear from an eyewitness? Or can I see a report? Or can I hear from somebody who's a true expert like yourself, which is why journalists, we interview folks like you. And that's what I really like. But, it's a longer conversation, but there's been a huge fragmentation in the media landscape because newspapers, the business model is shot. But on the plus side, citizen journalists are out there, and millions of other people are out there playing watchdog roles and doing some amazing, positive, great work. But then people who might be destructive are also doing their work. And so it's become a much more confused mishmash of ideas and information. So yeah, I do share the frustration about journalism. The last question that I wanted to ask you, and then please feel free to add something else, add anything else, but how do you think, what connection can you make between political science and the role of a citizen? And how can political science and an understanding of it help someone better contribute to the health of our democracy?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to what you were saying about your understanding of the relationship between your role as a journalist and your role as a citizen. I mean, I think that citizens should be knowledgeable about how the institutions that govern them work. You threw out a little nugget of information a moment ago that, as a political scientist, it doesn't surprise me at all, but where most people they don't know the difference between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, right? I mean, yeah, like your average person, your average voter even, right? Because there's a difference between a person who lives in the United States and a person who is a voter, because about half of the people who live in the United States don't vote either because they're not eligible or because they choose not to vote. But yeah, people don't know anything about anything. So I think that political science, like at least if you take some political science classes, you're going to know some stuff, right? You're going to know the difference between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. You're going to know what the term liberal means and what it doesn't mean. You're going to know what Marxism is, sort of, a little bit, right? And you're going to understand, the kind of distinctions between a movement like Black Lives Matter and a Marxist political movement, right? And you'll understand the kind of tensions, right? And so therefore, when politicians try to say, like, well, Black Lives Matter, they're revolutionary fascist Marxists, you'll be able to say, that's an utterly incoherent, unintelligible statement. Those words don't mean what you think they mean, right? So I do think that having a kind of working knowledge of politics, institutions, concepts, really makes us better citizens. And it's actually like a kind of duty that a citizen has, because if you don't have those things, you're just going to be manipulated, right? And then you won't even be able to be a citizen, which I think of Aristotle and his Politics. He defines a citizen. He's like, it's not just somebody who lives, in the territory controlled by a particular government, right? Because, we're talking about Aristotle here. So he's like, look, like there's a whole bunch of slaves here in ancient Athens, and they're clearly not citizens, even though they're living right alongside us, right? So there must be some distinction. And so then he's like, okay, well, what makes a citizen different than a slave? And he says, ultimately, a citizen is somebody who is entitled to a share in deliberative and judicial office. So a citizen is somebody who partakes in the offices of the state. And, I think he's pretty spot on with that definition. And in order to partake in the deliberative and judicial offices of a state, you have to have some knowledge. So I think political science in that regard is really, really crucial to good, active, participatory citizenship.
Fabulous. Well, I don't have any other questions. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. This has been delightful for me. I hope that our viewers, students out there, get as much out of it as I have gotten.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
All right, Tracey. I'll see you.
Okay, bye.